Well, hello, friends, and welcome back to How to Eat an Elephant.
Thank you.
The timing was flawless. Pause. It was beautiful. I opened my mouth and I said that, and then no more words. There were no more words.
Oh man, what a great
guys!
moment.
We met at an actual character. Well, not that the bishop isn't a real character, but as we discussed, he's not a real character.
No.
Right?
Well, Emily was just saying before we started that she was kicking herself because we actually meet one of our main characters about 54 pages in, right? But I've never made it this far myself. I always
bored
quit.
by the bishop.
Well, yes, I just didn't understand the significance of the Monseigneur Bienvenue guy, and I just kept quitting. And now I feel silly about that.
I know that I have made it farther. I just am really confused about myself in the past because I remember the Petit Gervais section, and for some reason I didn't know that I was also reading about Jean Valjean. I don't know what was going on the first time I tried to read this book.
I actually... Oh, go ahead.
Well,
I
I
have
was
a
just going
guess.
to say, I know that I tried to read it the summer after I got married, and I think that my brain just must have been complete mush.
I also think that reading in the context that we all are is unique. We're reading with an eye to talking about it with someone. And so there's an engagement. You're participating in a conversation as we're reading right now in a way that when I was reading by myself and no one was ever going to ask me about this, I wasn't paying. I hate to admit I wasn't paying attention.
I also think
revelatory.
I also think, Emily, that you shouldn't feel bad. I imagine there are lots of people who, if they're really, really honest, undertook some ambitious reading projects less than 1 year after graduating from college and found themselves unequal to the task of reading more. Right?
Totally. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we met a real person, by which, of course, we mean Jean Valjean. The principal character has entered the scene finally.
Yeah, dude.
And we don't necessarily mean to say the bishop is not a real person, but as we discussed last week, he's not a real person, right? He's an exaggerated symbol of goodness and charity that provides contrast for the terrible conditions of the working poor, etc.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I just think that this is a romantic work, and I'm starting to see it all over the place. And I think that maybe all of our characters are going to partake of that caricaturization, like as opposed to characterization. I mean, with CA caricature, right?
Yeah.
Like a overdrawing.
Yeah, I have on page 101, but I think it's significant everywhere. In our version on page 101, I have written at the top, his descriptions are explicit rather than subtle. They're well drawn and beautiful, but he goes all the way explaining what he means by the significance of each symbol, which I think here at the outset feels a little laborious, but I think that maybe, but it also, I think that is part of the romantic genre, and you have to give your heart to it, and it's going to be beautiful, and it's going to grow on you over the course of this long novel. But right now, like coming to it fresh, not having read a romantic work in a while, it does feel a little bit to me like these are broad strokes and caricatures rather than characters, and that he's not trusting me as a reader to imply some things. I don't know. I found that equal parts lovely and a little bit ponderous this time. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I mean, there's a moment in our section where Jean Valjean has taken the silver and run away, and Madame Magloire comes out of the house to the bishop, frantic because the basket containing the silver is gone, which of course means she's frantic because the silver is gone. And she says, "Where's the basket? Where's the basket?" And he goes, "Oh, here it is," and hands her the empty basket, which has been tossed in the garden.
With the silver.
It's almost like he's a 9th grader or an 8th grader that is sort of pig-headedly refusing to get the point, even though he knows what the point is, right? And it's supposed to be this radical selflessness, like the silver really truly doesn't matter to him down in his guts. But all we normal humans reading the work look at it and go, "Oh, okay, you're laying it on pretty
trying
thick,
to be obtuse."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What do you think, Emily? Do you feel that too? Are there other scenes that stuck out to you in that regard?
No, I mean, I guess I just hadn't thought about it from that perspective.
Well, and I want to hasten to say that I don't mean it in a negative sense only, that it is a little bit on the nose, if you will.
Right.
But like there's that scene where Jean Valjean, and I hope we talk about this thematically because it's lovely, but where he's standing over the sleeping cure or the sleeping Monseigneur.
Yeah.
And and Hugo says something like, there are moments when the natural world forces us to see something true.
Mhm.
And the clouds broke and the moonlight shafted
Shaft
down
of moonlight.
onto Monseigneur's face.
Right.
And you have the villain and you have the good guy, and the good guy is literally glowing from without and from within. And this means holiness,
Right.
you know, and I understand, I do.
Yeah.
But also it was explicit, you know, like he went ahead and told us every part
Mhm.
that should be significant, made the natural world serve his ends, but then also wanted to explain how it was doing that, rather than like in a Shakespeare play, there's not explanation of the natural world bearing up the thematic significance. It is, and there's note of what's happening in the natural world, but there's not also authorial interpretation on top of it. Does that make
Right.
sense?
There's a little bit of a
That does
show
make
don't
sense,
tell
yeah.
kind of scenario. But and Emily, it sounds to me like this really plays nicely with your comment about caricatures, because I think he's doing that in the way he sets up his characters too. Right? That he's oh, there's a word that eludes me. He is so when you're playing a sport, you can telegraph your next move, right? There are habits of body that let your opponent know what you're about to do and respond to it ahead of time. And I think that he's doing that as an author.
Mhm. Yeah, I see that. I see that for sure.
It doesn't bother me though. I mean, there were moments in our reading selection for today that I thought were really moving. And
yeah.
and he isn't there's a difference, I think, between an author doing that when his project is also kind of pat and his message is a little trite. This doesn't feel like that at
Well,
all.
yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking, is that there's Hemingway, who
Mhm.
is very sparse. That would probably be the opposite end of the literary spectrum,
Oh yeah, I think so.
who tells us directly what he's going to say, but never explains, and so you're left to imply. But this is like a frosted cake where it's very sugary and very sweet, but there's layers. Like
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
supports its own richness, because yes, he's telling us the meaning, but actually there's also underneath of that, there's a whole bunch of threads of things going on that he isn't telling us explicitly, that makes it all the richer.
Sweet. Well, I'm excited to tease those out a little bit. I definitely caught, I mean, he's doing a lot of work. He's doing tons of allusions and using all kinds of literary devices, and it's a spectacular work of art. I just need to get back into the swing of reading a romantic, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a stylistic departure for sure. So let's dive into Jean Valjean's actual story. And this is the I mean, I was a little disappointed. Annoyed is the wrong word, because I love his style. I'm actually really having fun reading this book.
Oh yeah.
But it was sad to me how brief a number of pages the actual story part about the character that we're supposed to care about was, in contrast to the descriptions of the bishops in his everyday life. I mean, we got what felt like a lot about every single detail of the bishop. And then Jean Valjean shows up and his entire life story is told to us, and the situation with the silver happens, and he's brought to the brink of himself morally, and he sees the face of God, and all of that happens in the space of like 15 pages. At least it feels that way. And maybe it just felt that way because, you know, there was plot finally. But
Yeah.
but it seems like he didn't spend as much time on that as I wish he would have. Your thoughts?
The way that he introduces Jean Valjean to us, I think, is really significant. Whereas with the bishop, we were given intimations of his background right away, and then he expanded on it. When we meet Jean Valjean, he really doesn't tell us much about him at all. And in fact, going through it, if you already know the story, I feel like you have to practice
Not
seeing it
importing
with
stuff.
new eyes, because what's actually going on is we're introduced to a convict and we know what he looks like. And we know that he's kind of gruff, and we know some basic things about how he presents himself. But Hugo allows his character to unfold slowly over time so that we kind of are introduced to him much like the strangers that are
I think
introduced
that's
to
a
him.
great comment. I noticed that
I
too.
like that
I actually
too.
think it goes one step further. We don't know that he's a convict when we first
Yeah.
see him. We just know that he's a guy from out of town.
Yeah.
And our suspicions about him grow along with the people in the town until on page 62, I think it's the innkeeper comes to him and says, "I have no room for you." And we wonder why as much as the traveler does. He says, What are you talking about? You're going to give me food. But he says, "I have no room for you." He says, "Well, put me in the stable." I can't. Why? We're standing with Jean Valjean at that point as the reader, still confused about what's going on. Until the bottom of the page, the innkeeper says, "Stop, enough of this. Shall I tell you your name? Your name is Jean Valjean. Now shall I tell you who you are?" I think it's amazing that we learn who Jean Valjean is as this innkeeper says, "Shall I tell you who you are?" No one can give you an identity that way,
Yeah.
but that's how we encounter his person in the story, which I think is really thematically rich.
Yeah, I love that. The fact that I hadn't caught that the innkeeper is saying, "I'm going to tell you who you are,"
Yeah.
instead of Jean Valjean getting to be in charge of who he is or getting to express
Right.
who he is.
Or some kind of omniscient narrator who takes the voice of God, and says, "Let me tell you the
Which
intimate
Hugo is going to
secrets of
have
this
no
man's
trouble
soul."
doing here in just a couple of
Right.
pages.
Of
Yeah.
course, but he
But it's
doesn't
cool that
present
he
the
doesn't do it
character
at
to us that
first.
way. So we
Mhm.
feel, I felt wronged for Jean Valjean when that's what the innkeeper says to him. "Shall I tell you who you are?" And I thought, how dare you? No one gets to do that except God, But that's why Jean Valjean is the way he is, This is
Right.
the posture that the world has taken towards him from the very beginning. I was immediately on his side.
It's also so clearly Christological imagery.
Oh yeah, with the
uh,
no room at the end part.
Yeah, and I guess it's a little on the nose too, but this is one of the things I was talking about, that he never comes
Mhm.
out and says it, but there are several times where I mean, so he's turned away from the inn, and unlike, the Christ story, he's not even allowed to stay in the stable.
Mhm.
He is turned away everywhere and has absolutely
Even
nowhere
from
to
a
go.
kennel.
Yeah, even the dogs turn him out. Even nature, right? There's like a progression.
Mhm.
He tries the really nice inn in town, and he doesn't get in there. He tries the lesser inn. He doesn't get in there. He tries someone's house, and that doesn't work.
Mhm.
He tries the dog kennel, and that doesn't work. And then it ends with him looking out into nature, and we're told that nature is uninviting too.
Yeah.
So there's just like he gets all the way down to the bottom.
Mm. When he tells, when he finally ends up at Monseigneur Bienvenu's house and he's telling him about this all in a rush, trying to be the one to identify himself before someone else is going to give him a label. And he's doing it kind of defensively. He explains his progression out and out of the town and into nature. And he says, "The dog bit me and chased me away as if he were the man and I the dog. I went into the fields to sleep under the stars. There were no stars. It looked like rain. And where was the good Lord to stop the drops?
Yeah.
So I came back to town." So maybe even a conflation in that moment of the natural world and the face of God. He
For
feels
him, yeah.
rejected utterly. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that the innkeeper can't give him a name, and like you guys were saying, no one gets to do that, right? But it even happens typographically.
Yeah.
He gives the name Jean Valjean, the innkeeper does, and then Hugo persists in using generic terms, the man, the traveler, over and over and over again. And the first time his name comes back into the narrative is when he stumbles into the bishop's house and says, "I am Jean Valjean." So there's a sense in which, for Hugo, he actually does have the power to name himself. And it seems like right now that's a power for ill, right? Because what we're getting out of him is bitterness and an account of all of the wrongs done to him. We're about to enter a discussion of whether those wrongs are real or imagined, and to what extent he is responsible for what's happened to him in his life. But one gets the sense that when he says, I am Jean Valjean, he means something different than the bishop will mean when he calls him his brother. Right? There's an identity that he's claiming that is not, that's not maybe fully true. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah.
I think I understand what you mean. Do you mean that he, in naming himself this time, is claiming his history defensively as an explanation of why he is the way he is? Like, I want to be the first to name myself because what I am is a victim. I'm not a convict. I'm not someone dangerous to you. I've been abused, and let me name myself first as like self-defense. Is that what we mean?
Yeah, a little bit. And then also it's an accusation of the bishop implicitly, right? This is how everyone treats me, so it's how you'll treat me too. So let me give you the salient details. Let me give you the things that will allow you to go ahead and reject me, because I know that's what you're going to do, right? This textbook arm's length defensiveness from someone who's been victimized. And that is, on the one hand, the first time his name comes back into the text in his own mouth. And so the things he says about himself matter to us as readers, right? We should be paying attention when an author gives their main character the right to speak for themselves. On the other hand, it's a very one-sided picture that he gives. And it seems to me that since the identity of this man is going to be the focus of the section, it's interesting to note that he starts it by saying, here are the ways I'm a victim. And in so doing, here are the ways you're going to reject me.
Right.
The fact that he doesn't give his name, though, while significant in all the ways you're saying, I'm sure also allows the author to play with a lot of illusions. Not only, Christ, the Christmas story, but also this is the man, right? Like, this is, is that the baptism?
Like societally.
Yeah, like, well, I mean, Christ in that too, right? When the guy opens his door at the little home that he stops by and says, "Are you the man?"
Yeah.
Right. Like there's a kind of a echo of the Christ story in that as well. And like as you're talking, like the man of no name, the traveler, like that's kind of Odyssean in some ways.
Oh yeah.
Sure.
The man trying to get home, and our section for today opens by drawing an explicit comparison with Napoleon, which is something I did not expect. We're told that the man was entering D by the same road that 7 months before the Emperor Napoleon had taken from Cannes to Paris. So I think it's so interesting, and I could see him trying to sustain this over the course of the book too, right? We know that we're going to get a crazy chapter on Waterloo. The fact that he's drawing this comparison with Napoleon's 100 Days, in which Napoleon also is coming home to France from an exile and is greeted with parades, right? Like he's basically marched triumphantly from the coast into Paris. And you contrast that with Jean Valjean, who isn't, who's rejected at every turn. And yet, if you think about the arc of this story, Napoleon only gets that for 100 days before he's going to be exiled again. So the contrast there, I think, is interesting, and I wonder what he's going to do with that.
I dig that a lot. I wonder. Yeah.
I was thinking as you were talking, and maybe this takes it in another direction, but when you said he lacks a name, he is the man, it reminded me of that big chapter of the image of a drowning man left behind by his ship, and how the man is supposed to represent the plight of humanity, of the poor. Yeah, the plight of the downtrodden humanity left behind by the ship of society that should be responsible for it, Right. I don't know. I think he's definitely supposed to be an everyman,
Right. Yeah. Even in his name, Jean Valjean, it's a Jean, like very common French name, and then Valjean, aren't we told that his paternal name is like, it just means like,
behold, Jean.
Yeah, voila, Jean. Jean, voila, Jean.
Yeah. It is I.
Yeah.
Jean. So I can hear us moving into the description of the society, and really the question that what I would use to sum up the section is, to what extent is Jean Valjean responsible for his life and for what's happened to him, and to what extent is this unjust societal structure and the human law responsible? And I want to have that conversation, but that would be skipping over what I found to be one of the most important moments in this whole section, which is as they're sitting to dinner, the way that Baptistine records it in what Hugo calls a naive letter, right? She records the conversation between the bishop and Jean Valjean in naive detail. And one of the things that the curé says, I'm just going to read this to you and see what you guys think. The man paid no attention to anyone. He ate, this is page 78. He ate with the voracity of a starving man. After supper, however, he said, Monsieur Curé, all this is too good for me, but I must say that the wagon drivers who wouldn't let me eat with them live better than you do. Between you and me, the remark shocked me just a bit. This is Baptistine speaking, right? My brother answered, but they get more tired than I do. No, replied this man, they just have more money. You're poor, I can see. Perhaps you're not even a curé. Are you only a curé? Ah, if God is just, you deserve to be a curé. God is more than just, said my brother.
Ooh, I got chills.
Whew, that's a line. I wrote it in all caps at the very top of the page. God is more than just. What on earth does that mean? Discuss.
That's beautiful.
Man. Well, yeah, go ahead, Emily. I'll go next.
Nope, go ahead. I was literally just saying it's beautiful.
It is. It's really beautiful. And I think it is, it's leading us in the direction that he wants to go for the rest of this book, which is a conversation about justice, a fixation with justice being destructive. Not that justice is not important as a virtue in and of itself, but the fixation with the law destroying a life, not just from the outside, but from the inside of a man. I think Jean Valjean is obsessed with the law and has identified himself as either a failure or a success based only on his own qualifications.
His relationship to justice.
Yeah, his relationship to justice, whether he has been wronged, that's a conversation about justice. Whether he is truly deserving of the punishment that he's received, that's a conversation about consequence and justice and, retributive or otherwise. This is a conversation about justice. Even his ideas about God are twisted, but he says, I don't know if this is significant, but he says at one point, I don't understand men of religion. I don't understand men of the cloth because I was denied closeness. When they came to us as convicts, they were far away. We couldn't hear them. On page 75, he says, we couldn't see this man too well. He spoke to us, but he wasn't near enough. We didn't understand him. That's what a bishop is.
Yeah.
So even if someone was going to come and explain that God is more than justice, I think Jean Valjean's answer would be, I couldn't possibly have known that. So you can't judge me based on that. Again, a fixation with, I am this way and I deserve to be because of justice. Because justice. So
for the bishop to kick things off by making that simple, innocent, direct statement that for me just stands up out of the page and says, I'm the point here, right? God is more than just. Leads us into that section I was talking about a second ago, the discussion of Jean Valjean's responsibility and the responsibility of the law in the corrupt society. Leads us into that with this very personal note, because the rest of that conversation, there were a couple of different descriptions of the way he treats him over dinner that had to do with what is most compassionate, suggesting that the thing that is more than justice about God is his compassion, right? What's the best thing to do with a bruise? Not touch it at all. Remember that description?
Yes, I do.
And there's a sense in which the curé was, or the Monsignor was intent on treating Jean Valjean like any other person, refusing to acknowledge the things that Jean Valjean has made his identity, refusing to treat him in the terms that he has decided to treat the world with.
Yeah. Well, even what we were saying about names. He says, before you even told me, I knew your name.
Right.
And he says, what do you mean you knew my name? How do you know my name was Jean Valjean?
You knew my name was Steve?
Your name is my brother. Right. You knew my name was Steve. No, but like what you're saying, he says, let's turn your eyes away from your preoccupation with whether you deserve your name or not. Your name is something completely other than you've ever considered.
Yep.
And like you said, the basis of it is compassion and the nature of Christ and being a sufferer. You know,
God is more
it
than
gives
just.
you are welcome because you are suffering. God is more than just.
What do you think about that, Emily?
I think that's beautiful. I had to go ahead and circle that line. I completely missed it, but
I did too.
Absolutely the point. I was struck by it. This might not be important at all, but I was struck by a little detail we're given before Jean Valjean enters the scene, which is that the bishop is busy writing a work on duty, which unfortunately he never completed.
Because his duties got in the way.
Yeah, and I think it kind of fits in that there's the letter of the law, there's the to write, that's the theological magnum opus, right? The words of the bishop, but they're not as significant as the relational aspect of his life, and we see that play out for Jean Valjean as well.
And it's as confusing to him as it is to us. I mean, we were just talking a second ago about the fact that the bishop is kind of a caricature of holiness and a caricature of compassion. And we all look at it and go, okay. I mean, I can see what you're doing here. Okay, fine. But this isn't realism, right? It's romanticism. Jean Valjean does the same thing. I mean, I think it's kind of a gotcha moment between me and Victor Hugo when Jean Valjean is being ushered into his bedroom. And he turns to look at the bishop and he basically says, okay, dude, come off it. Right?
Yeah,
like,
you're not real.
You're not real. You're faking it. Have you thought about the fact that I might be a murderer? How's that grab you? Right? And the bishop just doubles down, and I can hear Hugo doubling down also. And the bishop replies, God will take care of that. So I guess the question that I'm being faced with is, well, do you believe or don't you? Because there's really no other options for the bishop. He looks around and says, I believe. So everything about my life has to be in light of that fact. And that's what Jean Valjean is about to be faced with, right? He steals that. We got to fast forward through the great moment here because we need to talk about the next thing. So he goes ahead and steals the silver, gets caught promptly, which is true of every time he's tried to run away, right? He gets caught promptly and drugged back before the door. And the bishop, of course, instantly says, hey, you forgot the candlesticks. And those are worth more than all the rest of the silver combined. Don't forget to take those. Oh, hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate you bringing this guy back, but there's no problem here. This was all a gift. Facing Jean Valjean with the ultimate proof of his perspective on the world, his charity, his compassion, and his conviction that the Lord will take care of him and his, so that he can take care of the Jean Valjeans of the world, right? And this faces Valjean with a critical decision. And I can't find the spot, but the way that he put it was incredible. He dimly felt that this priest's pardon was the hardest assault, the most formidable attack he'd ever sustained, that his hardness of heart would be complete if it resisted this kindness, that if he yielded, he would have to renounce the hatred with which the acts of other men had for so many years filled his soul, in which he found satisfaction, that this time he must conquer or be conquered, and that the struggle, a gigantic and decisive struggle, had begun between his own wrongs and the goodness of this man. And then on the following page, he says, if he were not the best of men, he would be the worst, that he must now, so to speak, climb higher than the bishop or fall lower than the convict, that if he wanted to become good, he must become an angel, that if he wanted to remain evil, he must become a monster.
And
this is the choice he's being faced with.
Unpack in there, because also that is justice at its heart. It's black and white. There is no middle ground. You are either good, all the way good, or you are bad, all the way bad. And he is being faced with that, but also he's bad, all the way bad. What do we do now?
Well, and it's so for a guy that
section ends. Yeah,
that's how the section ends. He looks at I just think it's fascinating that we don't end our section with the curé saying, I've bought your soul and given it to God. Go now, live well. And Jean Valjean is not transformed by that. He's burdened by that. He goes away and his soul is rocked and he doesn't feel, I mean, it's obviously the beginning of the transformation. But after that, he does it wrong. He steals immediately from a little boy who's sobbing. Like that is what changes him.
I think it's really important to notice.
I'm a miserable man.
Yeah, I think it's really important to notice that this moment that I zoomed to happens in between two important things. The silver is stolen and then given to him as a gift, and he's set free and he's bewildered. And then we get the narrative of his prison time, right?
Yeah.
And the narrative of his prison time goes down just so that we understand the weight of the burden that he's facing. And then we get a discussion of the burden and the choice. And while he's reeling in the midst of that decision, we get Petit Gervais, where he basically steals from this kid out of animalistic habit. He's not thinking, he's not paying attention. He's shocked to find that he has done it. And there's a line in there where Hugo says, as strange as it may seem, he had done something of which he was no longer capable. Right? Like his heart has actually been softened. The hardness that was there has been affected by the gift of the bishop. But it hasn't sunk in yet enough to change his habits, to change the way he lives. And so you're right, Megan, like the end of the section, the verdict is your heart has been changed in spite of these things that you are currently doing.
Well, yeah. And it's almost, it's not salvation imagery so much as it is imagery of escape, like a convict getting out of prison. On page 111, it reads, at first, even before self-examination and reflection, distractedly, like someone trying to escape, he sought the boy to give him his money back.
Yeah.
Then, when he found this was futile, he stopped in despair. At the very moment when he exclaimed, I'm such a miserable man, he saw himself as he was and was already so far separated from himself that he felt he was no more than a phantom, and that he had there before him, in flesh and bone, stick in hand, a shirt on his back, a knapsack filled with stolen articles on his shoulders, with his set and gloomy face and his thoughts full of abominable projects, the hideous convict, Jean Valjean. So here he is standing outside himself, as if something has happened to help him escape the prison of himself. And now he's afraid to ask, that. Who am I?
Yep.
You know?
Yeah, that's so very good. Well put.
I think that this might be the most significant instance of the word miserable that we've seen thus far. And it's probably always significant given the title of our story.
Right.
But the fact that this is the moment when Jean Valjean looks at himself and says, I am a miserable man. And then this is going to be the story of the Misérables, which is, you know, the suffering, the poor, right. Sometimes even like the wicked, right? Like the I don't know, there's a conflation of the lower classes and the crime in the streets of Paris. Like here he transcends all of that, and it has nothing to do with his social class. It has nothing to do with his status as like a convict before the law. When he says I'm a miserable man, it's almost theological, right? The miserable are, I don't know that is like, I don't think anyone can escape that classification now in this story, right?
Except the bishop, who we've already established is the symbol of another way, is the symbol of a different life, right? And a little bit farther down on the page that Megan was just reading from, in Valjean's conscience, there are two men, he himself, the miserable convict, and the bishop. And the bishop gets larger and larger and larger in his mind until he himself is so small by comparison that he disappears. And all he can see is the example of this goodness, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I have two thoughts, and I'll just have to say them one at a time, but they don't go together. One is a follow-up to Emily's, the correlation between Jean Valjean saying that he's miserable and the connection to the whole title. I think he makes it explicit on page 112 when he says that Jean Valjean weeps bitterly, more powerless than a woman, more terrified than a child. It harkens back to that, the little prelude to our story. Yeah, the preface. Thank you. Where he says, here's the problem with a man, here's the problem with a woman, here's the problem with a child in a society like ours. Right. Here, Jean Valjean becomes all three. and he's titled miserable. But the other idea that I don't know if it goes with it, he calls himself a miserable man after the bishop pronounces, "Go now and be an honest man."
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something to suss out there.
There's a tension.
Yeah, that or maybe the one is the result of the other. The truest thing you can say about yourself is, I am a miserable man. Who now will help me? Who am I now? Now that we've admitted that.
I guess what I meant by tension there is that the bishop says, "Go now and be honest." Literally almost without thinking about it, like almost without culpability, in a reverie, steals from this kid.
Yeah.
And his honesty is stolen from him, right? He was honest from the moment the bishop forgave him and said, "Go in peace," until the moment he steals from this kid. He lived as an honest man.
And I think this goes back to what you were saying about naming, though. Jean Valjean, whether or not he has the right to name himself. In this moment, he says, "I am a miserable man."
Right.
But the bishop said, "You are an honest man."
Ooh.
So it's and he immediately contradicts that. But then we're still left asking, who has the right to name him? The bishop says, "I've named you for God, right? I've claimed you for God. I name you honest." And yet Jean Valjean says, "I'm a miserable man." So who's going to get the final word?
Yeah, I think for me it was, and I didn't want to, I'm trying to read Victor Hugo on his own terms. There's obviously some gorgeous theological underpinnings here that we could suss out for days and days and days, but I do think he actually is concerned with justice, and the opening poem or meditation at the beginning of the novel makes it really, really clear that this part of the thematic driving force behind this novel is the social justice issues present in Hugo's world. And so let me finish the comment. He is actually concerned with God and a God of justice. And the bishop doesn't say, "I name you honest." He says, "Promise me you'll use the silver to become honest." Right. And the bishop isn't given his holiness by a gift. He's given it by dint of long effort and habit. And there is some traditional Christianity going on here when it comes to Hugo's conception of virtue, right?
I think that the two ideas are twinned together really well in the conversation about whether Jean Valjean is guilty or not.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So in the section where we're told about Jean Valjean's history and he's meditating on it, let's see, this is page 86, chapter 7, The Profoundest Despair. He's meditating on whether or not he was wronged, and he says, well, first of all, we're told that he wasn't ignorant, or he was ignorant, but he was not stupid, and misfortune is its own kind of inner light, which is kind of an unrelated comment, but I think is beautiful.
He says it again later a little differently when he talks about him as a visionary.
So suffering is a kind of education,
right?
But it says he acknowledged he had committed an extraordinary and reprehensible act, that the loaf might not have been refused him if he had asked for it. And so the first step, which allowed me to take Hugo seriously from a theological perspective, is that he acknowledges that Valjean is guilty, that he could have done it differently. But then we get the conversation about if he was at fault, who else might have been at fault? And we get society like pinning him between, he calls it unreasonable carelessness about the fact that he is an industrious man who can't find work. And what's the other word he says? Unreasonable carelessness and pitiless care. Yeah, that treats him with such cruelty in proportional to his
exacting. Yeah, careful in making sure he pays every cent and more. Pitiless care, I thought this section was, well, this is probably what I'm just going to hew to over the course of this whole podcast. But the fact that it begins, we get to see all of this about Jean Valjean because he sets himself up as a judge of his own life. He says he set himself up as a tribunal. He began by arraigning himself.
And then from there, he turns to society.
Right.
And it's really interesting to me that the last line of defense is turning to God. Himself gets a lot of paragraphs. Society gets lots of paragraphs. God gets a sentence. Did you notice that?
Where is it? Where's the sentence?
Well, what page are you on?
I was on page 87,
Okay.
dudes.
It's
So it should be
88 at the bottom.
Yeah, 88.
He sentences society to his hatred and makes it responsible for his fate. And then we get the line, sad to say, after having tried society, which had caused his misfortunes, he tried providence, which created society, and he condemned it as well.
Oh yeah.
So he conflates God with society, right?
Mm-hmm.
God has allowed society, nature, right beforehand, it's been allowed to treat him so poorly. He won't stop the raindrops.
The way that it's painted, I can see why he became this way. When he says a man never feels outraged unless in some respect he's fundamentally right. Jean Valjean felt outraged. I'm with him 100%.
Yeah,
I would feel outraged about this. The scales are completely weighted against him. I'd be so angry with God. I would, you know?
Yeah, I think that's really true. It's so compelling from both sides of the issue. And the fact that it all makes sense to me now after getting through this first Jean Valjean section. The fact that he described the bishop in such minute detail all makes sense to me, because it's this profound contrast, two ways of looking at the world, that I think are going to be at war with one another as we encounter a long list of, brace yourselves, people, very sad stories over the course of this novel. Brutally sad, heart-wrenching stories. And we're going to have these two options, right? We're going to, on the one hand, we could set ourselves up as tribunal and pass judgment on a God that would allow this. Or we could, as the bishop does, say, God will take care of that.
This is what makes it so deep, as opposed to just a screed against the society. I mean, that's certainly going on. He certainly has social concerns, and they're at the forefront. But also, there are all the theological elements, and I think that it's he's not just asking if society is just, but he's asking if God is just.
Yeah.
Do we serve a just God who allows the world to suffer in this way? Is the law of God just? And I wonder, I mean, this is not a literary comment, but I wonder if the rain imagery is going to be significant, given the musical.
We could probably surmise that it will. Okay, so I'm sorry, Megan, go ahead.
I have one more question, and this really is a question. I was reading along and sensed a tiny bit of enlightenment thinking / maybe humanism going on here. On page 89,
that was my next question. So well done.
Oh, was it really?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No, it's great.
He says, is there not in every human soul, was there not particularly in Jean Valjean's soul, a primitive spark, a divine element, incorruptible in this world and immortal in the next, which can be developed by goodness, kindled, lit up, and made to radiate, and which evil can never entirely extinguish? I just wonder if that is wrapped up in the conversation about the nature of God. Is he saying that divine spark in man is the image of God, which can never be completely erased, no matter how depraved a man becomes? Or is he saying that there's something, well, I don't know. I don't know how to finish my question even.
Yeah. I'll throw mine out. What do we do with the fact that on the one hand, we believe that men have immortal souls and that the image of God is present in man? But also, we don't believe this part. This is the top of page 89. Jean Valjean was not, as we have seen, born evil. He was still good when he arrived in the prison. There, he condemned society and felt himself becoming wicked. He condemned providence and felt himself becoming impious. So, definitely, I hear you. There's some humanism. There's some enlightenment thinking. There's the idea that
it's a little romantic.
Yeah, man is born good until he's corrupted by his society. But the combination of that romanticism with what sounds to be earnest Christianity from Victor Hugo is really interesting to me, because when we get down to the second to last paragraph on the same page, we're talking about whether or not he can be cured, right? And he says, a doctor would say no. But at the end, he goes, and like Dante at the gate of hell, he would have erased from that existence the word the finger of God had nonetheless written on the brow of everyone, hope.
Mm-hmm.
So in condemning Jean Valjean as a lost cause, you're trying to do something impossible, which is not to eradicate his inner goodness, but to eradicate something that God has written on his forehead, hope. That's actually a different statement from my perspective than the one at the top of the page.
I think so too.
And so I'm kind of confused.
How would he define evil?
Yeah, how would he define evil?
Right.
Yeah, maybe evil is hopelessness. If that's the case,
Despair.
I might be with him. Maybe despair is ultimate evil, and human beings are not born despairing. This is why I say I want to read Hugo in Hugo's language. I'm not trying to import some theological conversation, that he doesn't want to have. But this is so explicitly theological that I think it's worth talking about.
Well, it leads me to another theological statement, really. If we're allowed to consider that he's having a theological conversation at the same time as he's talking about societal issues, then what do we do with page 109, where at the top of the page, Jean Valjean is calling after Petit Gervais and can't catch him. And then this is how Hugo says it. That was his last effort. His knees suddenly bent under him as if an invisible power had suddenly overwhelmed him with the weight of his bad conscience. He fell exhausted onto a large rock, his hands clenched in his hair and his face on his knees, and cried out, "I'm such a miserable man." Then his heart swelled. He burst into tears. It was the first time he'd wept in 19 years. That feels like it's the last straining of his will to keep the law. Here he's seen, I've been told to be an honest man. Like you were saying, Ian, he's been an honest man since that. And then all of a sudden, in a vision almost, he steals, he's bad. There's no way out. And in that moment, he can't be self-sufficient anymore. He can't justify himself. That seems to be the turning point moment.
Well, I think there's some hope. That's right. And that leads up to the section that I read a second ago, right? The Titanic struggle that had begun and the options before him, which are to be an angel or to be a devil from the pit of hell. There's this justice that's injected back into the scenario for him. But I think it happens in the context of our character's walk, not necessarily from this bird's eye societal view that Hugo begins the novel with, right? This is how the question presents itself to Jean Valjean. And it should, right? Like nothing that we could call conviction has happened yet. And here it is. He's now wrong, period. And goodness looks unattainable. And evil looks impossibly bleak and black for him. And so then we turn to the next page, and Hugo kind of summarizes on 110. He says, like an owl seeing the sun suddenly rise, the convict had been dazzled and blinded by virtue. And then on the very next line, he says, one thing was certain, though he did not suspect it. He was no longer the same man. All was changed in him. It was no longer in his power to prevent the bishop from having talked to him and having touched him.
I love that. Well, yeah, it goes together. It was a strange
phenomenon, possible only in his current condition, but the fact is that in stealing this money from the child, he had done a thing of which he was no longer capable. So it is this it's simul justus et peccator, right? Simultaneously saint and sinner. This has happened. Our author assures us his heart has changed. And yet he sits on this knife's edge, this encountering this dilemma, the decision.
And maybe being good there's another pairing. He's now to reform. He's now to change his habits and to change the decisions of his heart. And yet this power from outside of him has forced him to his knees. He doesn't even understand the change that has happened to him. There's the use of the passive voice in that line that you just read. So it's another two things together: his action as a man and this outside force of benevolent ? God figure imposing his own structures on this man's life,
which are gentler than his own, right? That's the thing that makes me so excited to watch Hugo develop these ideas, is that on the final page of our selection for the day, he talks about how he there's a gentler light shining on his life and his soul. It seemed to him that he was looking at Satan by the light of paradise. In other words, he was looking at him. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. He's relinquished his position as the leader of the tribunal.
Mhm.
And so there's hope for him, right? That word that God has written on his forehead is operative all of a sudden. What do you think, Emily? You haven't talked in a minute.
I think that, yeah, I think that there's a lot of different conversations going on, and they're all intertwined really beautifully. It's complex, but that was what I landed on too, that in the end, what's most important is that he sees himself. Well, first of all, he sees himself through his own eyes as he really is. And by one way of looking at himself earlier, he saw that, yes, he'd done a bad thing, but really society, like he was a victim to society. But here he looks at himself and he like sees, in fact, like he compares himself to Satan, right? He sees him. It was like looking at Satan through the eyes of paradise. But it's through the eyes of paradise. Like he's given new eyes outside of himself by which he sees himself. And that seems to be the most significant and the most powerful thing going on, is that he doesn't look at himself with his own eyes anymore.
Yeah.
He sees himself through the bishop's eyes.
I think you're right. I think that's really important for us to all understand, is that the conflict that's going on is not over whether God will accept him based on his actions. The bishop is God so far as the symbolism of the novel is concerned, right? The bishop represents the attitude of God towards all mankind. And the bishop has already passed his sentence. Forgiven, beloved, free. That's it. And now Jean Valjean is grappling with that verdict and the fact that he doesn't agree actually with that verdict, because it doesn't account for two important things. Number one, the wrongs he has suffered, and number two, the evil he has done. And he knows both of those things to be true simultaneously. How on earth could the actual judge say, beloved, forgiven, free? That doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So when the bishop says God is more than just, he's saying something that it seems Jean Valjean is going to spend the rest of his life sussing out.
I think that's really important to remember, because I'm tempted. I was just tempted to say, like, look, he's like, now he knows the truth and
Right.
he's going
now
to
he's going to be better.
Now he's going to be better. But I love what you said, basically, that he now the struggle is between, like, he hasn't fully accepted the bishop's perspective on himself. The bishop who looked at him even like while he was contemplating stealing the silver and said brother to him, he can't accept that it still is dependent on himself, and whether or not he's going to learn his lesson going forward in the story. So I think that is beautiful and gives us a path to chart Jean Valjean's story on, right? This isn't a complete arc yet. He still has a journey to go on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm in. How do you guys feel?
I just want the violins. I might have to watch the musical again.
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't listening to it at least once a day. Well, thank you both for your insights and for walking through such a heady passage. There were so many things to talk about in there. I think we did a pretty good job. You guys are really, really smart. And thank all of you listeners for being with us. This is a joy and a pleasure. And we will see you next time around on How to Eat an Elephant.
2 books, 3 and 4 for next time.
Oh, yeah. 2 books, 3 and 4. Also, there is a schedule posted, right?
There is, yeah.
Go download the schedule. Okay. All right.
Do you look at the schedule?
Yeah.
You do?
No. I don't. I just call Emily.
You guys don't get to call Emily, though, so go download the schedule, and we will see you next time around on How to Eat an Elephant. Bon appetit.
Bon appetit.
Bon appetit.